It's okay, it takes time. I know.
Welcome back to Strong. I'm so excited to bring another incredible guest. Today, we are zooming out to Cleveland, Ohio, and we are meeting with Erica. Erica is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Learning Specialist who is also the CEO of Disruptor University. Tonight's conversation is going to be a little bit about Erica's education, about her work, and also about her perspective through the conversation that we're going to be talking about discrimination, racism, and equity. Welcome to Strong. I'm so excited to have you with me, Erica.
Thank you, Maria. I'm really excited to be here today.
I think the conversation we're about to embark on is one that I'm feeling a little more confident to have. If I had to rewind 4 episodes, I was really anxious about having this conversation. And what I'm starting to notice from my experience is that the more I talk about this, the more comfortable I feel talking about this, and the more prepared I feel. And this is what these conversations are really about. So anybody watching this right now, Erica, I hope will have the courage to embark on conversations like this, either with their children, with their colleagues in the staff room, or most importantly, in the classroom. But before we dive into that deep part of the conversation, I thought you could take us back down memory lane. I know right now you are an incredibly academic person. You have your doctorate in urban education policy and development. You have your master's in principalship, educational administration and supervision, and you have your bachelor's of education. So I know that right now you are equipped with incredible academic knowledge, but I want to take you back to that younger Erica, the teenager, the student in the room who was listening and learning and trying to discover herself and her future. Can you remember that younger you?
Absolutely. So I actually believe it kind of began with me when I was babysitting. And I was babysitting a younger cousin who we all knew he had a learning disability. And I was probably most of my teenage years, we just didn't know what it was. So what I realized over time is that we weren't never ever really taught to name things. We didn't always have the language to name things. We just kind of knew something was something. And so in helping tutoring my cousin, I realized that that there was a space for folks to support people differently. And so that's actually what triggered my yearning to go into education, but at the same time, a passion around voices and experiences that were very different from mine. And so throughout high school, I was blessed to be able to experience advanced classes. I was in elementary. I remember that my parents told me that I was gifted. And so as a result, I was on a different track. But I also remember two things happening. Number one, school closure, and we were bused to a different side of the town to go to school. And then number two, as a result of that, the peers that I played with in the neighborhood were never in my classes at this new school. And so, again, I didn't know how to name what was happening. I didn't know what exclusion and inclusion looked like at the time. I just knew my friends were in the class with me. And I knew that I went from being in a neighborhood where a lot of people were Black and brown and looked like me. And then when I went to school, into my classes, I had to figure out and find myself in those spaces. And so I feel like, two things kind of emerged as a result of that. It was one, just being raised as a leader in church with the family background that I have. It was, how are you ensuring that you are being the leader you're supposed to be? But at the same time, I was still trying to figure out myself. And so I noticed, like, even in high school, making it a point. I couldn't name this, Maria. I really didn't know what was happening, but I knew that I needed to go and sit at different tables in the cafeteria and talk to different people and have friends with multiple different people that came from different walks of life. And no one told me to do it. At the time, I had no reason why I was doing it. I just did it. And I think that really kind of speaks to the ways in which even now that I operate, in terms of understanding different people from different experiences. And so I would definitely say it was the experience of being, having situations of privilege, but at the same time having a disadvantage, but at the same time understanding that there was ways that I could work my privilege to help people at a very young age. Again, couldn't name it. If you were to ask me to tell you this when I was in high school or when I was in elementary school or as a teenager, I stood up for bullies as an elementary kid. I never forget, my best friends would come and get me if they were being messed with. So it was something that kind of just happened throughout my childhood, but not really being able to understand what it was. It's probably what I would say the most.
So I want to take you back to something that you mentioned, and I think it really stands out for me because it's one of those things as an educator, we think we're getting right. But you mentioned when I went to school, so in my neighborhood, and I'm quoting you, everyone was, black and brown. When I went into school, I was trying to find myself in that. So what I'm hearing is you didn't feel represented. You couldn't see people that you could relate to. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Even as my teachers, my peers, and at the time, my friends in my classroom, the advanced classrooms, it wasn't as if I felt excluded. I just didn't have the same friends that I grew up with. So I was making new friendships, but my friends weren't there.
But that's what I want to pick up on. So as an educator at the front of the room, I know that educators spend a lot of time planning their lessons, and they're looking at the different types of learners, and they're really, with the best of intentions, trying to ensure that they can cater to all the needs in their classrooms. But one thing that I'm yet to hear in a staff room conversation or in a team meeting is, are the students feeling represented? Are we looking at the curriculum and are we feeling represented? And this is not something that I was trained to do. And it was not something that I even noticed I was missing until I started having these conversations. And actually, for me, it all started when I took on a course called Diversity and Leadership. And it really made me look at theories, and it made me look at the research that's being done, and it made me critically analyze my own positionality, which then made me realize, oh my goodness, I've never, ever noticed that. Now, I know that if anyone looking at me from the outside, they'll identify me as closer to white on the spectrum. Now, what we learn from research is that people who are closer to white on the spectrum are taught very subtly not to see the things that you just mentioned. So as a teenager in a classroom, I don't remember looking at people around me and thinking they have the same color of my skin. I remember looking around me and thinking, where do I fit in? But it was never a conscious thought about the color of my skin. Now I know that I'm closer to white on the spectrum. What you mentioned is that when you looked around the classroom, what you were really, and maybe you didn't have the words for it, but you were noticing the color of people's skin. So where in your education and where in my education were we taught things differently? And was it a subtle teaching for you? Because for me, I never remembered, and honestly, I don't ever remember anybody sitting me down and saying, listen, you're white, they're not, you're different, they're different. I just remember being told your grades aren't good enough. You got to study harder, focus in class, stop talking. It was never a conversation. So for a teacher that looks like me, I'm looking out at my classroom, I'm seeing students. I'm not seeing color of the skin, but I'm wondering if there's a teacher that looks like you at the front of the classroom, do they see students or do they see color?
I think both.
Okay.
I think that from my experience, I'm what I call a culture responsive and sustaining educator. And so when it's a sustaining piece, it runs parallel to the dominant curriculum. It goes hand in hand. Cultural responsiveness is not an accessory. So I say that because for me, in my experience, I realized the importance of seeing both the student as a student of color, but at the same time, seeing all of my students. And the most important thing that I realized I needed to do, and my background in teaching, I was in a self-contained unit. So I realized in the early years of my experiences as a teacher, the self-contained unit where students are categorized as emotionally disturbed is literally the school to prison pipeline, right? Like we're teaching kids, they're practicing how to be in prison. And so I had to see my students, and I had to see the fact that there were students of color at the same time. And so as an educator of color, it's important to, and I try to be careful about saying things it's like code switch, because, who's to say that what is named as norm is the best and the right way of being. And so what I will say is that I try to work with my students, learn with my students, because they have things to offer me that I didn't even realize about their experiences. And as a result, it had to be culturally pluralistic. There's no one thing that is separated or teased out from the other. And if you, as an educator in my experience, if you can't figure out a way to ensure that you're always working on that and realizing that that is a process, a lifelong journey that never ends, you're constantly excluding someone. Someone is constantly not being brought into the conversation, not experiencing education the same way. To this day, I remember my senior year, the Canterbury Tales. Like, I remember we had to march around the school in these outfits. I can't remember what it was, but I'll never remember or like thinking like, why am I doing this? And I didn't have the words or language or even the courage to ask that question. I just knew that I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to do that. And I also felt embarrassed because this isn't something that I can go home and talk to my friends about in terms of school life experience. And if I did, the ways in which that it comes back to me will have me feeling isolated, because these aren't the experiences they're having.
I take a deep breath because here we are in this position. It's 2021. We're almost 2022, a few weeks to go, and we're going to be celebrating a new year. And I always wonder what's different this year in terms of how are we preparing young people for their future from your perspective. And everything we're talking about today is all very subjective, and it's all about perspective. And I think anyone watching this, there will be people that say you guys are getting it right, and there will be people that will pick up on things and say, I don't like why you're saying that. And that's why it's such a complex conversation to have. And I think sometimes, or actually most times, educators that look like me are too scared to have these conversations because they're afraid of being misquoted. They're afraid of the intention coming out wrong. Erica, you work with teachers, you work in schools, you work with students, you are a leader. Your university is called Disruptor University. I mean, just in what you've named it, clearly you are breaking down status quo and you are changing things. What kind of advice do you give to an educator that looks like me, or maybe even closer to white on that spectrum, and is skirting around this conversation, telling their colleagues, I'm just teaching what they tell me to teach. I am not responsible for curriculum. How do they have these conversations? How do we sit down with our students and say, listen, I think that there's something wrong and I don't know how to talk to you about it?
So I think two things are happening. Number one, we are asking folks, and this is not to say that as educators, we're not responsible to or for empowering, advocating, supporting, differentiating the ways that our students need. So I use those words intentionally. When we say we differentiate and we're going to do that, then are we really differentiating to the extent that is needed for our students to feel included in our classes, for them to think differently about education? So with that being said, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that most of the teachers that are educators have limited experiences working with Black and brown people. Like, that is just really what it is. At the same time, as a result of things that are coming into existence, we're holding folks to a standard of being more culturally aware. So when I talk about disrupting teacher socializations, I'm talking about the entire process. I'm talking about when I learned to be a teacher, which was when I was really a student and how you taught me, to when I go to teacher prep. And now the theory that we're speaking to, because, you know, you'll have folks who, I was in HR at one point in time, who will be able to speak and respond with a question only because of a limited amount of time they had dwelling in cultural responsiveness. But when it comes to actually putting in action, I'm going to default to whatever I use to survive with, and that's just how I learn. And so when I talk about disrupting, you know, teacher socialization or disrupt the university, it's all of the things that we were socialized to be. And not to say we're taken away from our own experiences or perspective, but in order to understand others, we have to become more culturally aware. I know you had made mention of the dimensions of diversity, right? There are so many areas of diversity that we have to make sure that we are thinking of. We have things that are, you know, that are apparent to our eyes, more visible. And there are things that, you know, as we spread out across dimensions of diversity, we don't see, right? And even within or across generations, there's diversity there. And I think, you know, oftentimes if we're going to say we're going to be inclusive, we need to think about the spectrum of what that really is. And then there's a thing that I talk to with educators a lot about. There's a difference between positive teacher-student relationships and authentic relationships. And positive teacher-student relationships kind of happens by default. You're in my classroom. I'm your teacher. And so you should respect me. I'm going to respect you, depending on where you're at and what happens at the moment, in any given moment. But then when you're existing within an authentic relationship, you're being a little more critical. Not a little more. Critical consciousness is how you operate. You are thinking about the social political culture and the context of your students, because how else can you empower? How else can you advocate? And I use empower very loosely, because you even have to be careful about the assumptions you make in terms of someone needing this or versus you wanting to push it on them. And so agendas in terms of developing my classroom, I couldn't do that. I couldn't create a community without understanding what a community is to my students, without understanding what it exactly they went home to that I can help them to kind of navigate through. There was no such thing as school and home life and classroom not blending into the same spaces. If that is the case, that's not an authentic relationship, right? When you think about the relationships that happens over time.
I want to pause you for a minute and just go backwards. I'm going to keep doing this because I want our guests to kind of keep up and reflect on some of these deep things that you're saying. So going backwards, you mentioned critically reflecting, and that is one of the main differences between being a positive educator and being an authentic educator. However, the assumption there is that the educator had access to that kind of learning, because I know that when I qualified as a teacher, I won't announce that number. We want to keep my age kind of a well-kept secret. But when I did go through teacher training, they did not teach critical reflexivity, you know, and it is only something that I came across doing a master's degree and having the opportunity to even do a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or aspiring to do what you've done and gone on to that PhD. There's privilege and access there that not everybody is entitled to. So not only are we educating our young people, they're going home and they're educating their parents, assuming that their parents have had access to education or programs. It is a really hard conversation to have. So those unconscious biases keep creeping in because, like you said, it's our autopilot, isn't it? We always, unless we're critically aware and really consciously aware, we just autopilot back to, you know, our original settings, which is how we were taught and what we were taught. So when we're speaking to educators, what I really want to know, Erica, is how do we have this conversation? So if I'm sitting in with my team and we're looking at the curriculum and we're looking at what's going to be taught, number one, we need to be aware of the kinds of biases and the subtle discrimination that's coming through those things. And I know in past conversations, we talked, with our guests, and we said, call it, just tell the students, fine print, this conversation was taken, let's put it in context. This is the time frame. Let's go back in time for a couple of minutes. At that time in history, this is what the world looked like. Today, we are aiming for it to look this way. So whatever we're learning right now doesn't mean that we agree with it. It means we're going to take a historical kind of footpath and see what's going on. Other than that, I don't know how else an educator can really help their students to identify that what they're teaching does not mean it's what they're preaching. It just means we need to get students to finish the curriculum so that they can take the tests. And unfortunately, that's where really teachers are struggling, because it's not that they want to teach it, it's that they have to teach it, especially in those countries where national curriculums require certain topics to be covered. And these topics, unfortunately, are, they're as old as the policymakers that have made them. So we can't always break down those barriers, but I can't think of how else a teacher can have that conversation with their students without feeling confident to do that. So what would you say? How would you approach that situation?
So I am a strong advocate for, I'll start here, but I don't want to dwell in this space too long, the Intercultural Development Inventory, where it allows you to see where you are in a continuum of, and I'm sure you probably have heard of it before, but if not, for those who haven't, you can see where you are in a continuum of your own intercultural competence. And the reason why that's important is because in order for you to understand more and learn more about different experiences, perspectives, you got to first learn about yourself, right? If you are existing within the dominant culture, you may not understand culture. You may not even realize that culture is happening in front of you because it's normalized for you from your lens. And so becoming self-aware is the first thing. I actually flew in, I was out of town, and last night, this is a true story, this actually happened. So I'm waiting for my luggage to come in from baggage claim, and a white woman walks up to me and says, hey, I would like to have a conversation with you if you don't mind for just a moment, entertaining this conversation with me. So I'm a little nervous. I'm like, okay, what is about to happen? So, but I'm like, sure, let's do it. And so she says, how does a person who looks like me get to know and develop a friendship with someone who looks like you? And I was like, right? Like I really was blown away because first of all, I commend her for even wanting to engage in that type of conversation, for feeling comfortable to having those conversations. But my response to her was really where I'm going to begin now. And so in order for us to leverage differences to build relationships, we have to begin with what we have in common. And it's not to say we stay in that space, but that's where a relationship begins. Think about all the people that you have a relationship with, really good relationships at that. The people that you maintain relationships with. Now, you guys still go through your differences. You have conversations about those differences. Sometimes you get along better with some than others. Sometimes you might hold a grudge. I won't speak for everyone, but the purpose of engaging across difference, the purpose of beginning with commonalities is so that you can engage and leverage relationships through differences. And so that really is reflecting and becoming more self-aware. So you're asking a question around how do we help educators do that? Well, first, we have to make sure that one, we're recognizing the commonalities in the room, the similarities. We're all educators. We have some things that we experience within education that we excited about. We realize some privileges that we have that our students don't have. So now we're making connections. We're becoming safe. Now you have to ensure that you're also creating a brave space where people don't feel some kind of way about asking questions, but they just don't know. It's not to say that you're accepting. It's not to say that you have to be the person that gives them all the answers, because at some point in time, if we're going to call ourselves lifelong learners, it is our obligation and our duty to do some research on our own. But it is a space to begin. And until we get to a space of beginning with commonalities, and I say this all the time to people. People come in this space at different points in their journeys. And as a former administrator, I had to realize when I closed the door of a classroom, I needed to leverage the relationship with the teacher in such a way that even when I leave, they're going to do right by kids, even if they're frustrated with me. And so leveraging across differences is everything. And the way we have our conversations is everything. And the way we create the safe space to have the conversation is everything. But at the same time, we have to have the language and understanding to build a relationship so that we're still interrogating and questioning what is status quo. As within my position, we do foundational equity training because people have different ways of understanding the language associated with diversity, equity, inclusion. Oftentimes, because of what businesses push, folks think that diversity is enough, right? But it doesn't matter if I don't feel included. And that's kind of what was happening, even with me in my space in high school. You need to know, I'm not going to say that their intent was to increase diversity within classrooms, but that's what's happening today. Oh, we want to ensure that we have more Black and brown kids and gifted programs. We want them to have access to college career curriculum. But if cultural responsive education isn't happening in those classrooms, they're not going to want to stay. They're going to drop out of teacher prep programs. They're going to go to their counselor and say, hey, take me out of this class. It's boring. I can't make any connections. My friends are here. This isn't a space for me. So, yes, critical reflection is important, but it's a process. We're undoing 20 plus years of experiences and perspectives that have been influenced by our family and education. So it is a process. And I'm not going to say I'm excited about how long the process takes. But I will say that it's important for me to understand my space and my place within my time.
So let's rewind to what happened to you yesterday at the airport.
Mm-hmm.
This individual walks up to you and opens up that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
You are Dr. Erica Glover, prepared. You're like the guru of all things diversity and inclusion. Right. So she really lucked out in this conversation. I think it's important to pick this out because you were not just Erica. You are, this is what you do for a living. Mm-hmm. So it was like the angels had helped her select the best person in the room. However, by asking you this question, it's like the oppressor is meeting the oppressed and saying, what is it? How do we do this? It's like, I know that I'm the oppressor and let's remind you that you're the oppressed. How do we make this work? I mean, I heard you say that and I was cringing inside thinking, oh my goodness, like to even open up that conversation. And I'm almost hoping this was part of research. And even if it was a little bit unethical without letting you know why. So we know that this woman, maybe it was just a way for you to prepare for today, to have this conversation, who knows? But hearing you say that, I'm cringing. I'm thinking, how are you so calm? Because obviously it was your training and obviously it was you taking a big breath, but really, I mean, in your position, it could have gone a completely different direction with all respect to the individual that would have made it. Because in a past interview I had with Mrs. Mabuzi, she was telling me that we can only get through this when we start seeing the humanness in each other. Stop seeing color, stop seeing nationality and community difference, and start seeing humanness. And if you look at anything that has to do with young children, that's exactly what you see. They don't see color. They just see the human in front of them. So you going back to that conversation, anybody out there thinking, oh my goodness, like what was that woman thinking? I applaud her for having the confidence to ask the question. What I don't applaud is the assumption that you were going to be receptive to having that conversation. So how did you not become the younger version of you? How did you stay composed?
Right.
And how are we giggling about this right now without using really interesting words to describe what that conversation was really about?
So it's funny that you say giggling, right? Because oftentimes as an oppressed person, And it's not that it's funny, but you can't do anything else but laugh. It's like, it's it's surprising, right? It's so surprising. It's just like, really, what? But you get used to it, unfortunately. At the same time, I've promised myself over the last 6 years that I wouldn't allow the places that people come from to influence my own joy, influence how I would treat the next person. And I'm gonna go back to my experience as an educator because I truly think that it prepared me for how I respond to people. As an educator, as an evaluator, I still, as a former coach, I was a basketball coach. I paint the picture the best way through this story. I coach boys, high school boys, and everyone thinks they're the man, right? Or the person. Everyone thinks they should have the ball all times. And if you make a mistake, you are the greatest thing ever put on this earth. So the mistake probably wasn't yours, right? And so we had so many issues with relationships because of those things that I remember, pulling them together one time and I said, hey, it's 2 seconds left on the clock. The worst shooter in the room, the ball rolls to them. Do you want them to make the shot or miss it? And they look at me like I'm crazy, like, duh, you want them to make the shot. Exactly. So what type of confidence, what type of leadership, what type of support am I providing to this person before they get the chance to take that shot? And I need you to think that way in order for everyone on his face to feel, in his room, on his team, to feel safe enough to take this shot with confidence. And so I bring that back to my experience as an evaluator. I needed teachers to feel not safe, because there is a sense of urgency, safe in their space of learning, so that when it's time to have any conversation I need to have with you, we can. At the same time, I understand that there are things, language is important, right? I can say equity and you think equality. So if I'm coming into a room and we're talking, I said, well, it's inequitable and you think equality, then I've missed the opportunity to build you up to equity. And so I think it's important that we realize those opportunities, those spaces where if we're not careful, we'll lose somebody too quick. They won't have the confidence to have the conversation. And I could have been a person that determines in her next conversation that she thinks differently. And I want to ensure that I always have. Is hope enough? Absolutely not. But I'm going to have the hope that I need.
But I'm going to play devil's advocate right
absolutely.
now. Okay. Absolutely. And that was a moment for her, whoever she was, to walk away understanding how to have the conversation. And I think this is where we're getting it wrong, Erica. I think this is where we're being too busy being polite and we're actually not moving forward. So if we could rewind back to that moment, she approaches you and asks you the question, you instantly take a breath and go, oh, great, here we go. Just wanted to get my luggage. Rather than saying, I'm really happy that you asked me this question. Let's look at how you asked the question and let's look at why you asked the question. What is the intention? And are you aware of the subtle oppressive nature of the question? That's a learning moment for her. That would be a moment where she walks away and says, I never thought about that before. But what happened, and I think, Erica, you fell into what I'm hearing is you fell into what we teach students to do is not to really tell people what we think. And we teach students that they need to be polite and they need to be politically correct. And what that really means is that the oppressor stays oppressive and those that are minoritized stay minoritized. So rather than being worried about being polite, we have to change how these conversations happen. We need to see each other based on the humanness. I agree with Mrs. Mabuzzi that we need to see each other with the humanness. And the only way to do that is to stop seeing color. Now, I might be living in a fairy tale, but this is where I'm hoping the world takes us to, because why else are we having conversations, and why else are we educating, and why else are we creating programs like the one that you've created in the Disruptor University? The next time somebody approaches us, we should be able to say, why do you believe that we're different? What do you see in me that makes you feel that you need to ask me that question? And it's not because I'm trying to be confrontational, but it's because how do we change this mindset if we keep being polite and keep allowing the subtle discrimination? I mean, how is that landing for you in everything that I'm saying right now?
Oh, no, that is perfect. So the rest of our conversations, because she went to go get her bags at the point in time her bags had arrived. And I was still waiting for mine. And so she brought her bags over and she started to talk about her family back where I had come from, where I was, the city I had come from. And she talked about her husband. And she said, yeah, I'm going home to my husband and he's disabled. And I said, oh, okay, well, that, she started to talk to me about his experience. And you can hear her privilege coming out from her conversation because it seemed like a burden for her. Without, I hate to say it that way because I'm making assumptions based upon the tone in the conversation. But our conversation ended up going from there was, well, I wonder how he feels when, folks are looking at him as if he can't do this or he's not ready for this. He had to stay home. And she says, my parents both are deceased. I'm leaving his parents. And, when I go to his parents and I'm doing everything that I'm doing, this is just a different conversation. And I have to come back home to what I'm experiencing with him. And so I reiterated again, like, well, I still wonder how he feels. And she says, you know what? We talk about it, but I really don't get a chance to understand it. And I said, well, maybe you should try to understand how he feels. And she said, oh, you know what? You're right. We kind of said a couple of more things that had nothing to do with the conversation, but she left and she walked away. But to your point, yes, I think that it is important. You say polite. For me, I'll reframe it from my experience. I think it's opportunity to have conversations. I think if you think about the dimensions of diversity, there's also a space around diversity of thought and thinking. And the way that I process things is very different than the way that other people process things and the other way that other people operate. And so I tend to take my space and my time to reflect and think and come back and have conversations. It's the first time I met this woman, so I don't know how much of a conversation I'll ever get that back again. But I do that very often at work in the space that I am. And, people will say maximize your opportunity. I do believe that quality of life is important. I just had a conversation with a colleague, my roomie actually, and we talked about quality of life, especially in the space of trans. You have folks who are very religious who just doesn't believe that those things should be happening to that extent. But at the same time, I think it's also important to understand your own space and your own way of thinking and acknowledge your own process. And it's not to say not to interrogate, but I'm coming and operating from my own space.
And I appreciate that. And I know that me telling you what I'm telling you also comes from a place of privilege where I've been taught that I'm allowed to speak out without actually being told you're allowed to speak out. I've seen people speak out and I maybe that's where this subtleness is different in that you probably have been taught to be patient and I've been taught to no, say what you need to say and get it done and get out. And is that possible? Is that where it would be different?
Well, I'll push back on taught to be patient. I've been taught to be me.
Okay.
And so, with that, again, anyone that knows me will tell you, oh my God, she's a processor. I won't answer questions immediate typically, especially conversations that can influence some way, one way or the other, because that's just me and how I think and how I operate. It's not the same. It's not to say it's the same for everyone else. I've had mentors and folks that I work with where I throw things at them and they'll say, well, I couldn't do it this way because da, 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 da. And I'll say, you know what, I appreciate that perspective. And I take that perspective. But yes, I'm going to operate from the space that I know for myself. That's number one. For number two, I actually just had a conversation with a colleague, not even a colleague. We're on the same Zoom call for some type of professional development. And I forget what the conversation was verbatim, but at one point in time, I say to her, in the space that I operate in, the space that I'm working in, I get tired of always saying something. Like I get tired of it. To the extent that it does something to your mental health. You become someone at home to the people that you love the most that you're not even with at work. And there are times where you have to make sure, for me in my experience, I maintain my own mental and emotional health. And, for me in my experience, in terms of things that I can say that I honestly regret because I acted off of emotion, it's important for me to maintain my space for my own mental and emotional health. For me, and again, I'm speaking from my experience, and I say that all the time in my perspective because it's only mine.
Of course it is. It is. What do we do to help young people grow up so that they can create a world where we only see humanness and we don't see difference, where we can't redo the past, we can't change the past, but we can learn from the past? How do we do that?
I think perspective is everything. What's interesting is perspective is in the state of Ohio, I should say. It's in all spaces of curriculum. Now, even though curriculum is written from a dominant experience or dominant history, you have perspective in art, you have perspective in math, you have perspective in social studies and English. I think it's important for us, going back to the dimensions of diversity, understand perspective. And I'm not going to listen to you, Maria, if you're yelling at me. I'm not. And I also need to understand how to navigate through conversations so that you continue to listen to me. Because as soon as you get to yelling at me, and if I don't understand the way different cultures experience conflict, then I'm not getting to anyone but people that look like me, right? Again, it's not to say that I'm giving anybody a freebie or anything of that nature, but understanding the conflict resolution across cultures is important. And I'm speaking outside even the dominant culture. I'm speaking around, to cultures I don't even understand. So if we're asking students to be able to speak up and speak out for themselves, is something, number one, that we're modeling through the way we have conversations with people so that they continue to want to listen. And even if they disagree, the way we're framing it is in such a way that they have to either be respectful or I'm still figuring out a way to come back and have conversations with them. I watched, and some of viewers may not be fans of this particular series, but Power Book 2. So I watch it, I binge it all the time. And Ghost's character, his son, is attending this prestigious high school. And so you watch him navigate the streets and the school after the death of his father. His mother has gone away in a religious program. And he meets a senator. And the senator and him are having a very, I wouldn't say respectful, but they're dialoguing about the difference between pharmaceutical sales of drugs and street drugs. And to hear how this young man, it comes with privilege because he's at a prestigious school, but to hear how he can still identify with himself and his experience, but still counter against another person's experience was phenomenal. I almost want to tape that part of it to show students, and not all, but different clips so that they can see how you navigate. Because at the end of the day, we still have to exist in, or we still are existing in a dominant, a world that is a country that is being run by, white men in power. And so it's important for them to understand, how do I navigate through those spaces? How do I disrupt those spaces through even the way that I navigate as well?
Love these conversations, Erica. I think they're probably, I learned so much after meeting my guests and getting into these conversations. And I know it's going to be one of those conversations that you have to keep having. And it's not just one. You're right. It is perspective. I hope that we can keep having them, and I hope they come into the classroom. Just before I say goodbye, you promote advancing skills and efforts to supporting diversity, inclusion within education. In some of the comments that you said today, I think your nature is what screams out to me the most. It's that calmness about you, the ability to listen to a question and kind of, I could see you thinking and then carefully bringing out what your thoughts are. And I also heard you say it's about role modeling to youth how to do it. Is this the approach that you take when you're working with educators that may be fixed in a mindset? Or do you have tips for a leader out there watching this saying, I really want to do this with my educators, but some of them are just not budging?
I think just like we want our students, we say that we should individualize experiences and education for our students. I'm going to say the same should be done for educational leaders. Too often we generalize everything that we do, and in the world, in the space of education, that leads to outcomes and the trajectory of life experiences. We can't afford to do that. This space is so, what's the word I'm looking for? Imperative and important to how our students are influenced. And so I'm gonna go back to what I said earlier. Folks come into this space at different places of their journey. And just as if I'm going to meet my students where they're at, we have to do that with adults and leaders. And I'm not going to say it makes me feel good to be the oppressor, right? And to have to exist in a space where in the state of Ohio, there's House bills that is speaking to critical race theory within schools, right? And having to operate and navigate even through that has been something that I think that a lot of folks don't even understand, right? And so you have this space where even within education, folks that are existing in education are even question why they're here, right? And so one of the things I talked about often when I was going through my dissertation is that I am going through an identity crisis. And I said that because the racial Black identity structure and the research all around it is real. And so you have different events that happen in your life that push you back through this cycle of reimagining, reinventing yourself racially, and then comparing yourself to what is the norm and trying to find your space and exist with that, but at the same time remain committed to some things that are through your own values and your beliefs. This space of education that we're living in, I think, and I just said this recently to a couple of colleagues, quite honestly, if we're going to really impact education, it has to be through the curriculum. I think it takes power and wealth to do that. And I think that we have to figure out where those spaces and opportunities are, because if we are teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion within the curriculum, we are developing the lens to now interrogate, even as we're looking at things from different perspectives.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you for bringing your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience. And I think more than anything, your authentic self. This is the most important part of these conversations, to be kind of leave those egos at the door and be able to engage in conversation and be able to call each other out and say, you know what, did you hear what you just said? And what if you heard it through my ears? What could you have heard? I think that's a great way to teach people how to gain perspective. And like you said, I would advocate for a school leader hiring in recruitment, making it mandatory that every new individual, regardless of what role they play in the education system, that they do need to go through critical reflective practice, and they also need to go through diversity training. And I think it shouldn't just be the one time. It should really be ongoing and every year as part of that mandatory training.
So, and Maria, and so like even I push back against that because it's even before they get into the space of being hired. That's why I think, disrupting teacher socialization, from a student to teacher prep to even being higher. Like,
Oh
if
yeah,
I'm
definitely.
lucky,
That goes without a shadow of a doubt. But I'm
right,
talking about
right.
those weathered educators. We
Hmm.
also, I think it's important to remember that you can't blame someone for the type of education they
Exactly,
had. I mean,
exactly.
we're in the business of educating and empowering with knowledge. So when they do get to recruitment, it should be, you know what? Normally, this would be mandatory, but understanding that your training has not allowed you would be probationary, and then looking at how they do it. But yeah, the ideal is this happens right
Right,
from
right.
K. Like, this shouldn't even become I'm hoping that one day this isn't even a conversation anymore. I'm hoping that
Right.
one day we're sitting down and reading the history book saying, oh my goodness, there was a time in the world where people didn't notice the humanness in other people. Like, what, how did that evolve? I'm
Happen. Right.
Erica, I'm so conscious of how much time I've kept you in conversation with me. Thank you for being with me. And thank you for allowing me to engage in this conversation and taking part of your day away from you.
Well, Maria, thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to continue to learn with. I appreciate it.
So amazing. Where can we find you, Erica, if we're an educator, a parent, or a student looking out and wanting to connect with you?
You can definitely find me at Erica. I'll give you my email address, ericaslover@disruptivuniversity.com. You can look us up on Facebook. We're at Disruptive University on Facebook. And we are also at Forever Forward, a podcast that we're going to be looking at best practices around disrupting work or disrupting status quo, regardless of your profession, your career, or even your passion. So Forever Forward is also where you can find us on Instagram and Facebook.
Amazing. Thank you. Please reach out to Erica and learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm telling you, I'm going to say it again. I love this concept, Disruptor University. It really sounds groundbreaking and change making. And that brings us right to the end of another incredible conversation. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And we will see you soon after the holiday season when we bring more incredible guests and more conversations to Strong.